Hey, all, thanks for watching. I just wanted to quickly inform you about my financial services agency, which operates in the life insurance space. So we help families with debt elimination plans and create tax-favored retirement solutions. We support small businesses, nonprofits, worker-owned co-ops, unions, and social enterprises with employee and member benefits. We offer white glove insurtech services to community banks, credit unions, financial co-ops, and CDFIs. And we provide enduring acceleration and downside capture strategies for all kinds of investors. Check out the link in the video description and enjoy the show.
All right, all yours.
You've got a bunch of titles. You got doctor, reverend, keynote speaker, author. I'll call you Doc Rev if that if that works okay for you.
Sydney is
but
fine. Sydney is fine.
Yeah, but Reverend Sidney Williams Jr., I'm really grateful to get to talk with you today about the work you're doing, about your writing, about your perspective on things, and also about neighborhood economics and why you want to be involved in everything. I guess I first kind of want to dig in a little bit on I know you went to Howard University and HBCU, and then you immediately went into Wall Street, and then you work in interdenominational theology. So tell me a little bit about how that all happened and how that all works together. That's a very diverse background.
Yeah, sure. So the kind of sort of weave the narrative, I preached my first sermon at 15 and felt a deep
Mm.
sense of call to serve the church, but also felt a deep sense of responsibility for my family and making sure that I wasn't practicing poverty. And so I chose to focus on a career in finance and did well. But always wrestle with what to do with the calling and where that fits in and when it fits in. 2004, my mom was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and kind of made a
Mm.
decision then that it's time to get back to serving and answering the call. So enrolled in seminary while still running a venture fund, and just really finally ultimately made the decision that I wanted to spend the rest of my life serving others. And I was very grateful for the career I had, but made a choice to give that up and serve the church full time, including being a missionary in South Africa for a year and a half. And over time, I saw the two kind of coming back together, that there was a deep need for an understanding of finance and economic development in the church. And so I found myself uniquely positioned to bring those experiences from my career and to serve the church in a much greater capacity than I even imagined.
That's pretty incredible. I'm not nearly as accomplished as you, and I would never pretend to be. But I had a similar journey in a way. My dad was a pastor. My aunt was a missionary to Sierra Leone in Africa.
Mm.
I grew up in the church, and I really felt the calling of helping people who were less fortunate than me, helping the least of these. And
Mm.
that's what led me into studying sociology, led me into being a case manager for chronically homeless folks and running a food bank and doing that type of work in the Detroit area. But I also ran into some problems in the nonprofit world where it was difficult to make enough of a living where I didn't almost need the services that we were
Correct.
giving
Correct.
out to people each and every week. And so I also moved into financial services, built a business and agency there, but always still felt the calling to do something that sort of blended those two and sort of brought in my intellectual endeavors and my social justice endeavors
Yeah.
along with the personal and along with the soul endeavors. I'm curious what that interplay and balance has been for you of the intellectual endeavors and of those, I guess, soul endeavors.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately the way the academy is organized, when I was at UPenn, the business school is separate. In fact, there is no seminary at University of Pennsylvania. In many schools where there is a seminary and a business school, there's very little interaction between the two. But I believe, regardless of your doctrinal convictions or religious affiliations, we all have a measure of faith. And that measure of faith shows up in ways, consciously or unconsciously, in how we think about money and economics. I think for me, I'm committed to the intersection of economics and theology, and how that plays out not only in the life of the church, but how that plays out in our communities, and particularly in our neighborhoods, which kind of connects me to the work that Kevin and Rosalie are doing, because faith and economics really do impact how we live out our experiences in community with each other.
Yeah, tell me more what you mean about that.
I mean, I think on some level, we've got Max Weber, the Protestant work ethic, this idea that, if I work hard, I won't be poor, right? That if I budget well, I save well, I work hard, I'm going to prosper. But the reality is there are systems of injustice, systems of inequity that deprive people from being their best selves and living their full potential. And so when you have a theology that honors the humanity of all people, it forces you then to look through a different filter, a different lens, not so much an individual lens that attributes success solely to work ethic, but one that looks at a system that says perhaps maybe we really ought to examine why the system isn't working for more people. And then for those who the system is not working for, what is our call to justice? What is our responsibility? We started our soup kitchen in 2013 in Morristown, New Jersey, and folks are really confused because, well, this is a wealthy county. We don't need this. In fact, one of my older church members said to me, he says, Pastor, if you stop feeding people, they'll get jobs. And so there's this theology of survival of the fittest that, if you work hard, you'll do well. And if you're not doing well, it's because you're not working hard. And so I find sometimes the most progressive liberal thinkers are extremely conservative and somewhat Darwinian when it comes to finance and money. And so, sort of weaving those two things together is critically important.
Did you experience, I guess, it almost feels like the position you're describing, you might be receiving pushback in some ways from both sides, as it were. Is that something that you experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are those who, I work with on Wall Street with, those I went to business school with, who are entrenched in this sort of Milton Friedman perspective that, everything should center around the shareholder, that all of our work is about, increasing profits for those who have sufficient investment capital engaged in the marketplace. And while that is the task is so much more than that, right? I think that's the bare minimum to meet the shareholders' needs. There are others at the Harvard Business School, like Professor Cotter, who talk about stakeholders, where it's not just the shareholders, but it's also the employees, the customers, community members, the environment. So it's more than simply I made enough money for my shareholders. And so I think on the business side of things, it's widening the lens and helping people see it's much bigger than just profit and loss. And then on the other hand, there's this sort of this utopian ideal of the lion and the lamb living together in harmony. That is a future state. But in the meantime, how do we live out the reality of the lion and the lamb or the wolf and the sheep, right? I love the part where Jesus says, be wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove, and helping us understand the reality of what it looks like to live among wolves, right? There are predatory lenders. There are predatory companies that seek our destruction. And we've got to learn how to mitigate that risk and navigate these very difficult waters of capitalism.
Yeah, well, as you're talking, it reminds me of a quote by the Dom Helder Camara. When he says, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint, and when I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist." And it does seem
That's
like
good.
there is a bit of a situation where we love the idea of doing charity work, of helping,
Yes.
and I think that's great. Obviously, I spent the first 5 years, well, 7 years really of my career doing that. Um,
Yeah.
but there does seem to be that pushback seems to me could come from both the some people that you may be in communion with in your faith, and then also people that you're in business with that would push back on the idea that this is actually a calling that you would have, is to do this work of justice in the name that you do it in.
Yeah. You reminded me of something that a mentor once shared with me, and it's the translation of the word love in Hebrew versus Latin. And the word love in Latin is charitas, which is where we get the word charity from, right? Which takes on its own meaning. In Hebrew, the word tezek which implies justice or obligation. Depending on how you translate 1 Corinthians 13, it can have a very different trajectory, right? If charity is patient, if charity is kind, if charity keeps no wrongdoing, that's a different measure of love than if we're talking about justice is patient, justice is kind, justice is long suffering. So, what are we committed to? Is it just giving of our free time, giving what's left over? People oftentimes come to our pantry giving us food they no longer need or food that they don't want to eat themselves. That's not quite the mission of our pantry. Our pantry is we want people to have the food that we also want, right? And so justice is making sure people have quality food, nutritious food. Charity is, well, I'm not eating it, so you can have it.
Right. It's the scraps. It's the leftovers. Yeah. It's the things that we don't want anymore. And well, may as well not waste it, in a way. One thing that I was really impressed with you too is because I know there's a lot of, sometimes there can be division around things that there don't need to necessarily be around. And it does, I mentioned, I saw that you had, it seems like it's important in your ministry to be open and inclusive to both people of your faith, both people that are, you would call believers, but also people who are not. Why is that so important to the work you do?
Well, I mean, I read the book, right? There's this book says that God so loved the whole world, right? So I think we skip past that piece, right? Not like he just loved the people who believe, but he loved all of creation, right? So I think if we read the book carefully, there's a mandate, there's an obligation for us to love all people, regardless of social, political, ethnic, racial differences. There's a command. Right? Jesus says, even love your enemies, right? That's what the book says. It's not always what we practice. And I think if we want the fullness of the joy that the book offers, we've got to be willing to experience and live out radical hospitality.
Yeah, it reminds me of a saying I've heard before, is that even like all knowledge is God's knowledge, all love is God's love. And so, I think that's great, because so often things, we could be working together on things that we all agree on, but instead we spend our time focusing on the stuff that we, might disagree on. I'm curious when we get into kind of the economics of things, because I know that's a lot of where your study, where your work, and where your writing has been. As things stand now, how do you see your theology and the marketplace working together?
So there's this dirty word called risk, right? And it always fascinates me how we measure risk. When I was in business school, we felt like we could do that through mathematical analysis. We could determine the beta of something or the volatility of something, and that would give us a quantifiable measure of risk. But in practice, risk becomes very qualitative, right? Risk becomes qualitative based on the people I'm investing in, my relationship or my experience in a particular region or territory or neighborhood. And so we're not honest about some of the discriminatory practices that are built in our risk assessment profile. And so, at a bare minimum level, it's really assessing, well, what is risk? And then how do we mitigate risk? Right. One of the key ways to mitigate risk is to increase our knowledge of a particular sector or particular relationship with people. But when we look at sort of the residential segregation that still exists in our neighborhoods, racial segregation that still exists in many of our communities, that then sort of increases the risk level and reduces the risk tolerance, because I don't know those people. I don't know that neighborhood. I'm not comfortable in that space. And yet the challenge for those of us in the finance field, it's to be able to not only qualify the risk, but to quantify the risk and then develop risk mitigation strategies. That's what fund managers get paid to do, to mitigate risk. And so when we don't invest in a particular sector or particular neighborhood because we don't understand the risk, then perhaps we shouldn't be responsible for managing that capital, right? So I think there's a moral and an ethical responsibility for those who manage capital to come up with risk mitigation strategies to figure out, well, how would I invest in this community? How would I invest in this neighborhood? What would I need to do to offset some of that risk? we do that in lesser developed countries where we want to advance economic stability in various regions. We know how to do that. But within our own domestic policy, within our own economic strategies in our own country, we seem to lose all those strategies, right? And so then we have whole neighborhoods going with not only not a lack of investment, but divesting out of neighborhoods because of risk, right? And then this other sort of dirty word, return, right? What is a proper return? And so in business school, that's a quantitative measure, right? We look at the risk-free rate, we look at the market rate, and then we determine the volatility, and then that then measures what kind of return we want. But when you look at payday lenders, is a 600% return excessive, right? Like, how do we decide how much return is enough, right? Auto lenders who lend people with low credit, the imputed interest rate sometimes are north of 50%. How much return is enough? And is it justifiable by the risk, or can we come up with other risk strategies? So I think we need to have more of a robust dialogue about risk and return. And then I think there are also people who feel very confident about giving out grants, but oftentimes those grants are woefully insufficient to move the needle. And maybe there's somewhere in between our philanthropic granting and our impact investing to say, maybe I can invest at a lower return because I better understand the risk, so I can really move the needle in some neighborhoods. So I think that's the work that Kevin and Rosalie are committed to, of creating this dialogue with neighborhood economics to say, how do we invest capital in areas heretofore that we've considered to be high risk?
Well, and I love that I do feel like you're kind of hitting on the heart of it with this risk and return idea, because of, what we're really talking about in a lot of ways is interest and debt.
Mm-hmm.
And, as you obviously know, the history of debt when it comes to things like the Jubilee year, where
Yep.
land would be returned, debts
Yep.
would be canceled every 7 to 50 years, and how that went away with the Roman Empire and with the oligarchies that formed.
Sure.
Um, and, we're in a situation now, even where when you look at even groups like, the World Bank or IMF or many of these other big institutional lenders within the country, they still charge interest, and sometimes very high rates of interest, but they've put themselves in a position where they no longer actually have that risk anymore, where that
Yep.
risk is backed up. And if, someone does default on the loans, they're going to get bailed out by something, some institution even larger and more powerful.
Yep.
Um, there's and you mentioned kind of those social relationships with money. Money can be a social lubricant in a way. It can be a way
Yeah.
to facilitate social relationships. But as I don't know if you've read Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber,
Mm.
but he has this quote near the end of the book where he says, ultimately, debt is a corruption of a promise. It's a promise
Mm.
corrupted by math and violence. And I'm just
Mm.
curious your thoughts on the debt situation that many families or maybe our country is in right now, and your perspective on that.
So I think there's two ways of thinking about debt. One is where I am completely disinterested in the borrower and more interested in the return of capital, right? So I will lend you money that is inadequate to fulfill your business plan. I will lend you money at rates that are unprofitable for your business knowingly, right? With full expectation that not only will I get all of my capital back, but I'm actually going to gain by the possession of your assets, right? So that's predatory lending. I'm lending you money with an expectation that you will default, right?
Right.
Um, and then there is lending where it's considered to be concessionary or catalytic, where I'm going to lend you a sufficient amount of capital to actually fulfill your business plan at a rate that allows you to actually earn a profit, so that yes, I can get a return on my capital, and I'm honest about the return I need to make, right? So I think it's very careful about sort of how we think about lending, and what is the goal. Unfortunately, in many cases, for people that lack an access to capital, they will borrow at every rate and on every term, and we engage in predatory lending almost as if I'm playing the lottery. Like, I know this loan is destructive, but I have a 1 in a million chance of winning the lottery, so I'm going to take this debt at all cost. And I think that's kind of where payday lenders show up, right? They are the sole source of credit for many people. And so people then engage in those predatory lenders, hoping somehow by some act of God, some miracle, that they'll find a way to get caught up, but in actuality end up in perpetual bondage to this debt. I think it's critical for those of us that identify as progressive or wanting to do some sort of social impact, is think of other ways to provide capital that is restorative, taking almost an equity lens, right? The difference between debt and equity is I have a relationship. I'm willing to bear some of the risk, right? As opposed to doing this at no risks to myself.
Yeah, I had on a guest who her name's Amanda Claypool. She had written an article called "Why Your Debt's Not Meant to Be Repaid," and she made this really interesting point that your debt, whether I hold a car loan or a mortgage loan, especially consumer debt, right? When you're talking about a business loan where you can get a higher ROI than your interest, if you're buying an asset with debt, that's great. But when you're buying a commodity with debt, that's usually where it's much more difficult and people get trapped, because your debt is their asset. They make money every time you lose money. That interest has to go somewhere. And I also thought it was interesting when he talked about how interest is only actually charged across classes. When poor folks lend their neighbors or their family members or anything some money, they usually don't charge each other interest. And when the wealthy lend each other money, whether it's institutionally or individually, they typically also don't charge interest. It's really only when the rich or the wealthy are lending to someone poorer, that's when that interest takes place. I could go on with debt for forever, but there's other stuff I want to ask you about.
But the illustration, what you just said, there's a lack of relationship, right? Right. If there is a relationship, I'm willing to reduce the cost of debt, right? If there isn't a relationship, then my risk assessment is elevated, so I'm going to charge a higher rate.
Exactly. One thing that you've had, your book is on, fishing differently, or I hope I'm saying it right. I didn't write down the name of the title, but you have this acronym FISH, and I'm curious if you could break down what that means, and just kind of give us a brief overview of the principles of that.
As I transition into ministry, as any banker or finance person would, I wanted to understand what are the sources of capital that make churches successful. And pretty much every church throughout the world relies primarily on faith capital. That is what members give when they gather for worship. And in many cases, that resource is insufficient to do the work that congregation is called to do. And so then I look deeper at sort of if it's not there in the offering plate, what other sources of capital are available to these congregations. The second and most valuable source within congregations is intellectual capital, the ideas, the creativity, the talents. And then I began to study why that intellectual capital is often not acknowledged or not resourced. And there's a professor at Princeton, she's now emeritus, Professor Deborah Hunziker, who wrote a book called Bearing the Unbearable. And in her book, she talks about cognitive dissonance, where people may be a part of a local congregation. They may even give financially in their tithes or their offerings, but intellectually disengaged, checked out, right? They've already begun to experience cognitive dissonance. And inevitably, what's keeping them from engaging intellectually is the trauma they've either experienced in that congregation, or maybe the trauma they brought with them to the congregation. But nevertheless, that is a source of capital that is often untapped. And then S is social capital. So every congregation exists in a particular context, in a particular community. And I discovered a lot of faith leaders limit their vision and their resources to what's within the walls of the church, and oftentimes missing the available resources in the region or community or city. And so, if you believe that there is a higher power at work that is not dependent on our works, but rather there is an actual divine plan for restoration, then I think the challenge becomes, how do we tap into that social capital? Or I think what Robert Putnam talks about is sort of reweaving the fabric of our neighborhoods, right? Um, there may be somebody on the other side of town across the train tracks who cares about what you care about, but our relationship has not been established. And so part of the social capital is, okay, who do I need to connect with outside of my sort of hub or intimate circle of friends? And then finally, human capital, right? Which is, what is the output, right? So I know most, Christians or faith, pure persons of faith, sort of preach a gospel that we can't measure the impact of, right? But I think for the marketplace, they need to see a measurable outcome. Like, if I were to invest philanthropic dollars, investment dollars, time, intellectual capital, what is the human output? What can I see as a result? So whether that's providing housing for the homeless, whether that's helping with recidivism or people in recovery, like, how do I measure the fruit of this work, right? And so if you read the book, it says, people need to see our work. People need to see the fruit. And so if you're going to work with unbelievers, they're not going to buy into what they can't see. They want to see what's the fruit, what's the evidence that whatever it is you're teaching or preaching is actually working. So that's the ancient fish. So we created that back in 2004 and have just kind of leaned into how do we teach it so that you get faith leaders and congregational leaders to look beyond just what shows up in the Ark Plate on Sunday, but how do you tap into the abundance of resources available?
Yeah, it does seem to really kind of encapsulate a lot of different ideas, as you said. It almost sounds like it's sort of the outpouring or outcome of you being both a pastor and a CEO at the same time. Would you say that's true, or how have those two things interplayed? I am curious about that.
Well, I mean, so in 2008, I brought 30 pastors to the Wharton Business School. I was really trying to answer some questions that I had because I couldn't quite understand how the vision of many of these congregations would ever come to pass using the model they were using, right? Gathering, a group of people who are barely surviving on a Sunday morning to talk about a God we've never seen, that somehow this is going to be this manifestation of all this community transformation. I couldn't make the connection of how the preaching and the worship, actually brings about a viable business plan to actually do the stuff we're talking about. And so I brought these 30 pastors to Wharton Business School to sit at my professor's feet and have a dialogue. And two things I remember from that experience in 2008 is, number one, many of the pastors connected moral causes to poverty rather than structural causes, right? So coming back to neighborhood economics, many neighborhoods are failing because of structural causes: food deserts, access to capital, discriminatory lending practices, predatory insurance rates. Those are the structural things that deprive economies from flourishing. Many of the faith leaders connected moral causes to this economic depravity. And so that, for me, it was a revelation that the praxis by which many congregations engage in, which is preaching moral perfection, I don't know what the correlation is. Maybe someone's done the study on moral perfection versus wealth accumulation. But in my travels on Wall Street, I met a lot of people who I won't consider to be moral exemplars, but who have prospered very much so in terms of wealth accumulation. So, I think these are two different points. I think our desire for moral perfection might inform how we spend our wealth, but it doesn't necessarily dictate that I will be wealthy because I'm a perfect Christian.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it seems, but one thing that I'm just picking up from you a lot is you seem to be able to do this thing of integrating perceived paradoxes, things that most people would hold as opposites, but you're able to hold the two of them together in the same time and say, instead of saying it's an either or, choice. It can be a both and.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in the book, right? We have to be in the world, but not of the world, right? We live in a material reality. Um, and in that reality, there's a system that is not designed for human flourishing, right? Um, I think Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." And so we're
Right.
not waiting for this new kingdom, but we are seeing a manifestation of this kingdom that is in heaven on earth, like in our lifetime, right? In our existence. It's about helping to rethink systems, not living as they are, but redesigning them, reimagining them as they ought to be. Not trying to make slavery more palatable, but but getting rid of slavery altogether, right?
Yeah. Who'd have thought?
Right, but I mean, we can laugh now because fast forward, but there was a time where
Oh
people
yeah.
were just trying to incrementally improve a oppressive condition, as opposed to believing in a condition that people actually are free, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so I think we're always being challenged at every age and in every century to think about new systems, new ways of being, new ways of engaging, new ways of living that is more equitable and just for all people.
Yeah, and I guess what's coming to mind to me too is that, the reality that during the abolitionist times, you did have people of faith on both sides of that issue who were arguing against each other, both quoting the same Bible to kind of get at completely opposite things. The faith tradition that I came out of was traditionally abolitionist, and something I was always very proud of as a
Yep.
young boy coming up. But I also kind of saw like there was definitely a lot of creeping in of things that were opposed to that. And so, from my perspective, at least, things like, nationalism, wealth supremacy, some of these kinds of things. And I'm curious, from your perspective and having such a broad understanding of all of these different issues, how can churches and faith groups kind of make sure that they stay true to who they are and not be so influenced by the outside culture that they're in that way, while still being in the world?
So when I was in seminary, I remember my sociology religion professor said that you always have to do your sociology before you do your theology. And
Mm,
and that's parallel to sort of before you prepare a dish, make sure the dishes are cleaned really well, right? Because you
yep.
could end up contaminating the dish you're preparing because you didn't clean the dishes well. Or you may end up getting some flavors and some spices that you didn't intend to include in this dish you're preparing. I think our theology is the same way. We bring a particular social conditioning, right, to our theology. And then God begins to reflect more of our own personal imagination than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob informing our understanding of creation, right? I think we live in that tension, and our country is has a long history of how Christianity was used um, as a tool for oppression and dehumanization. Even going back to the Crusades, I mean, one could interpret, God's sovereignty in many different ways, and yet that's not the illustration Jesus gives when he comes on earth among us as human, right? And so I think, there is a heavy burden for all of us individually and then all of us collectively to examine how our social conditioning is influencing our belief systems and how we relate to one another. And what always fascinates me is oftentimes when you engage in dialogue among fellow Christians, we're less inclined to interpret the book and more inclined to defend our doctrinal positions, right? Yeah. This is how Presbyterians think. This is how Methodists think. This is how Baptists think, right? This is how
Right.
evangelicals think. And rather than saying, well, how do we interpret Paul? How do we interpret, Mark? Or how do we interpret John? Let's wrestle with this thing together. I find oftentimes people are unwilling to challenge traditional belief systems that are more dogmatic because of it's what their particular faith has ascribed to, and
Right.
less about, well, how is that being lived out? How are people experiencing that, right? Um, so yeah, I think we've got some work to do, and ecumenical and interfaith dialogue helps us to do that.
Absolutely. Another one of those paradoxes that I'm noticing from your work is
Mm.
you've mentioned the structure, you mentioned making sure those plates are clean, but when it
Yeah,
comes to actually also cooking the dish, and I know you like to cook, I love to cook too.
yeah,
Um, I think part of that cooking is some of your work in leadership development.
yeah.
Um, I guess what has been some of the most important leadership development lessons you've learned in first in your journey as
Mm.
becoming a leader, but then also in helping develop other leaders in the process?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the business field, there is a deep commitment to depressing or suppressing emotions, right? We
Oh yeah.
try to do
Oh
everything
yeah.
on a sort of quantitative basis while ignoring the narratives that people come into this conversation with, right? I think what I've learned from my theological training and serving as a pastor is sometimes people do things that just simply don't make sense, that they're just not logical, that are not in their best interest. And so I've been trying to figure out, well, why would that happen? And so part of the way I actually wrote the book is we start off with listening to the stories. Oftentimes people make irrational decisions because of previous trauma.
Mm, mm-hmm.
And I've dug a little deeper on that to understand that our trauma is reserved in the rear portion of the rear third of our brain, and is disconnected from the right frontal lobe where the cognitive processing and where we write and have articulation of speech. There's a disconnect between our trauma and how we articulate who we are and how we wish to exist. The work of a good therapist is to help you give words to your trauma, right? To be able to process. Um, Sometimes that trauma is best expressed in a poem or a song, and sometimes in words, right? And so when we create space for people to share their story, it begins to humanize themselves and allows them to begin to enter into rational dialogue. It's best seen, in my experience, in recovery meetings
Yep.
where people can share the trauma that occurred prior to their addiction, trauma that occurred during their addiction, trauma that occurred in their recovery. And sometimes those stories get repeated quite a bit. But the telling of those stories is a healing process that inevitably positions them to now be able to make better decisions for their own flourishing and for the flourishing of those they're connected to. Well, in the same way, even in the business community, there are people that have experienced childhood trauma, but somehow managed to subjugate that and become CEO of a Fortune 500 company. But they're emotional wrecks, right? And they make decisions that are not best for the shareholders and surely not best for the stakeholders. And so now we're seeing in the business schools the importance of emotional intelligence. That wasn't so when I was in business school in the 90s. But now people are realizing, even in the military, we need military leaders that are emotionally balanced. And so I think the church also has to make space for people's trauma and the things they've gone through. I mean, we've seen it very publicly with the Catholic Church trying to suppress trauma that has occurred within the confines of our churches. And that creates cognitive dissonance. And so, if we're going to talk about social impact, impact investing, community transformation, we first have to make space for healing. And even if somebody's made it to the office of bishop or whatever comes after that, they too need space where they can take the collar off and be transparent about things that have happened in their life that may be keeping them from not being a good husband or a good son or a good father or a good brother, good neighbor, right? Not to go too far with this, but Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, depending upon the trauma you've experienced in life, you may not even love yourself.
Yeah, isn't that the truth?
Yeah. And so then God says, okay, I need you to take inventory of what you've been through right? And then you see that with the man by the pool of Bethesda. He wants to talk about his trauma. And Jesus says, would you be made whole, right? I think that's the invitation to us as leaders is, would you be made whole? But we've got to take inventory of the trauma that we carry. Sorry for being so long-winded.
No, I'm so glad you did, because
Yeah.
what you're really talking about, I think, is a release of shame and
Yeah.
ultimately forgiveness.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I lived my whole life by forgive 70 times 7 to other people,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
was never taught to me, because it was never taught to the people teaching me that
Yeah.
that forgiveness also needs to extend to yourself,
Yeah.
because the relationship you have with the rest of the world is a reflection of the relationship that you have with yourself. And if you
Yeah.
don't actually forgive yourself, it's going to show up in all of these other ways. And to kind of bring it back to another paradox, the psychologist Carl Rogers says it this way, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says that um, it's only once we truly accept ourselves that we are able to change, and that change
Mm.
only happens in acceptance. And I love everything that you're saying about that. I think it rings absolutely true to my experience and
Yeah.
to my own, finally, because I had some success in business, but man, there was something grinding inside of me that I was not willing to look at. And it wasn't until I finally went to therapy and I
Yeah.
finally, dropped the shame and was willing to admit the things that I didn't want to admit to anybody, things I hadn't told anybody for 10 years because I was
Yeah.
scared of what it meant about me.
Yeah.
That I was actually able to go through a real connection to what we could call the divine, and to something greater than myself, and to who I actually am in a
Yeah.
real way. And so I'm so glad that you did go on about that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Um, I do want to also just ask you, I'm really pumped for the Neighborhood Economics Conference. I'm pumped to get to meet you there. I'm pumped for a lot of things about it. I know what I'm excited about it, but what are you most excited about it? And what does this conference mean to you from your perspective?
I applaud what Kevin and Rosalie are doing in not just in the work they do, but who they are as a couple, what they represent. Um, Deep Southern roots, um, experienced, some really racist ideologies as growing up, and then confronting all of that, internally and externally. And I feel like they have a deep heart for neighborhood restoration, um, trying to the best of their abilities within their own limitations, be bridge builders, and to make space for people who who are also traveling this road to meet each other. My first encounter with Kevin and Rosalie at SOCAP was in 2019, just before the pandemic. The people I met at that conference were like, I believe it's Seth Godin's book Tribe. I
Oh
was
yeah.
able to meet people in my tribe, and I feel like Kevin and Rosalie have created this space for people that are trying to navigate the waters of faith and social impact. Um, they've created that space for people to meet.
Yeah. I love it, and I love the key partnerships that are being brought together. Partnerships, again, that you may not expect, that a lot of people wouldn't expect. Um, and I'm really grateful for your time today, Dr. Reverend Sidney Williams Jr. Really enlightening, heartfelt, wholehearted conversation that we got to have here with you today. If you have any last words, I'll take them. But if not, we can kind of end it there.
The last thing I'll say about specifically about neighborhood economics is I think, and I'm just to talk about this country, we've been attempting to solve this country's problems at a national level. But I think while those efforts are noble and must continue, I think real impact happens at a neighborhood level, block
That's right.
by block, neighbor by neighbor. And what I appreciate the work of Kevin and Rosalie by even moving neighborhood economics to different neighborhoods, it's getting people that would not otherwise be engaged in conversation imagine what's possible, and you need someone to provide that catalyst, right? And so I think that's why so many of us answer the call to come to these neighborhood economics convenings, because we believe that it's our coming together that creates the spark and that stirs the flame for new creation, new opportunities. So big thanks to you and your work, and big thanks to Kevin and Rosalie for calling us together.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you in San Antonio.